Hello, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have my August wrap up. So I'm filming this a few days shy of the end of the month, but if I'm being honest, I've hit a huge slump. Today is Wednesday and I haven't finished anything since last Thursday. In fact, I've read like 90 pages in that time, so I'm not going to finish anything before the end of the month. And I have a special guest who will be Ryan from Reading with Ryan come in this weekend. As you're watching this, he will be here, so I won't have time to film then. So we're just going to get on with this wrap up. So in August, I read 10 books. It was a pretty decent reading month up until I hit the slump. I mean, if I hadn't have slumped, it would have been an amazing reading month, but I'm happy with how it went. So as you guys may know, I was taking part in the N.E.W.T.S Readathon. So this wrap up is going to follow the structure of the subjects in the N.E.W.T.S. If you're not taking part in the N.E.W.T.S, then don't worry, like you can still hear reviews of what I've read. It's not going to focus heavily on the N.E.W.T.S. I will just be mentioning which books completed which challenge for which subject. So first up, I should mention that if you want to hear a review for any of these books, so that is Rat Queens Volume 1, Batman Nightwalker by Marie Lu, Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, or The Giver by Lois Lowry, as well as That Girl by Colleen Hoover, then please go ahead and check out my Booktubeathon wrap up, because these were the 5 books that I completed in August for Booktubeathon, and I did a whole separate wrap up. Once again, you don't have to have taken part in Booktubeathon. I don't focus on that heavily. It's just a set of reviews essentially for the people who didn't take part in Booktubeathon but still want to know what I read. So I have 5 other books to talk to you about today, but first off we're going to do some stats. So in August I read 3,036 pages, which works out at an average of 97.9 pages per day. For the star ratings, I read 1 1-star book, 1 3-star book, 4 4-star books and 4 5-star books, which worked out at an overall average of a 4-star rating across the month. For the demographics, I read 1 children's book, 3 young adult, 1 new adult, and surprisingly a majority of 5 adult books. Formats wise, we had nothing too spicy. I read 9 standard novels and 1 graphic novel. And genre wise, I read 4 fantasy, 1 romance, 3 sci-fi, 1 dystopian, and 1 historical fiction. So the books that I mentioned that I wrapped up in a Booktubeathon wrap up, I will be mentioning them in the slot that they fulfilled for the N.E.W.T.S challenges. We're going to categorise them into subjects for the N.E.W.T.S in order of the one that I did the best in and the ones that I did the worst in. First up we have potions. The first challenge for this was to read a book with a colour in the title, and for that I read The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. I've done a book diary for this, which I will link up here if you want to see any spoilery thoughts, but essentially this is a young adult fantasy. I'm very hesitant about placing this in a genre that follows a girl whose grandmother wrote a book of fairy tales. She's never met her grandmother. Her mother doesn't speak to her anymore. But one day her mother goes missing and she has to sort of delve into the secrets of her grandmother's book of fairy tales to find out what happened to her mother. Now the first thing I want to say about this is that it looks like a straight fantasy. Picture medieval settings, horses and carriages, trekking through the woods, bows and arrows, that kind of thing. But it isn't. The best way to explain this book is to say that it's separated into 3 parts. The first part is sort of a contemporary magical realism type thing. It's set in New York City in present time. And then you have this section in the middle that's a bit like a wild fever dream. And then the third section is like full on fairy tale. I understand why people are very confused and not really fond of this book, because it starts one way, completely changes, and it's just a mindfuck the direction that it goes in. I did enjoy this. I gave it 4 stars because I expected it to be a straight fantasy. If I'd have known that it was in a contemporary setting when I started it, I may have had a different rating, but because I expected it to be straight fantasy, as soon as I opened the first page, I was shook, because it was nothing that I expected. And so from then on out, I had no expectations. So when it went off in these weird and crazy ways, I wasn't offended. I was just kind of along for the ride at that point. I would be hesitant to recommend it, but if you can go in with no expectations whatsoever, then you may enjoy this. What I will say for it is the writing is absolutely amazing. So if you like beautiful writing and you're not worried about a crazy plot, then maybe give this one a try. The second challenge for potions was to read a book with a male main character, and for this I read This Girl by Colleen Hoover. This is one of the books I read for Booktubeathon, and I gave this one 1 star. I did not like it. And the last challenge was to read a book over 350 pages, and for that I read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a romance historical fiction. I classified it as historical fiction But essentially it follows Evelyn Hugo, who is this 80-year-old Hollywood icon who is coming to the end of her life. Like, she's getting on. She will die soon, inevitably. She's old. She lures a journalist to her apartment under the guise of selling the magazine the journalist works for a story about some dresses that she's going to be auctioning off. But essentially she wants to tell this journalist, and this journalist specifically, her life story. The journalist has no idea why. So Evelyn embarks on this wild and wonderful story of her life working in Hollywood, but she narrates her story under the framework of the 7 husbands that she had. This book has LGBT rep. It has a lot of casting couch scenarios. Evelyn marries a lot of different men for a lot of different reasons. Evelyn is badass and ballsy and beautiful and amazing, and I love her. She's, I want to say inspirational, but she's not real. If she was, she would be, because she really shows that you can't get what you want unless you fight for it. She uses her sexuality to her advantage, which I've seen a review that says that's something they didn't like about this, but she sees herself and her body and her appearance as a tool, and she uses it. And I have to admire her for that, because she's a badass bitch that does what she wants, gets what she wants, and does not apologise for it, and I can't help but get behind that. I had 2 gripes with this. 2 major plot points I feel that would have had a lot more impact if you'd have experienced them through Evelyn's narrative were revealed at the beginning of the book. And the second gripe that I have is that I feel like the hype surrounding this book reveals too much, and therefore took away some shock and emotional impact that I could have experienced if I hadn't have expected some things going into it. Aside from that, I think it's absolutely beautiful, well worth a read. You should give it a go even if you don't think it's your kind of thing, because it's definitely not my kind of thing, but I loved it. The second subject is Care of Magical Creatures, and I achieved an exceeding expectations. The acceptable challenge for this was to read a book with an animal on the cover, and I read The Beast Player by, I still haven't looked up this author's name and I feel terrible. It's never gonna happen, is it? Like, let's be realistic. This is a young adult Japanese translated fantasy. I gave it 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. I've also done a book diary on this, however this one is non-spoilery and does contain a review portion with a timestamp to skip straight to the review, although the entire thing is non-spoilery if you do want to check it all out. But this is severely underhyped. I have heard literally nobody talking about this. I googled a review and there was one review, but essentially it follows a girl whose mother looks after these magical warrior snakes, and one day a lot of them die and her mother is sentenced to death for it. Her mother's dying wishes for her daughter to get out of the situation, and so she runs away and is adopted by a beekeeper. From there, she kind of grows up not knowing a lot about her mother. She remembers some things, but she's very distant from that world now. She doesn't know a lot about her own heritage because she's from like a clan or a tribe that's quite reclusive, but her mother had run away from those years ago, so she wasn't very familiar with their customs. And it is about her growing up and doing what she feels is right, without knowing that maybe she shouldn't be doing what she feels is right. And I know it's really vague, but I don't want to spoil it because it's really amazing, and I think a lot of you guys would love it if you knew it even existed. It features these wolfy winged creatures called royal beasts, and the main character does end up looking after one in this sort of like animal hospital, and they become quite close. It tells a story of people's relationships with wild animals, maybe what their relationship should be as opposed to what we want them to be. Maybe some animals should be left alone. And I overall just thought it was a really beautiful, magical book. It's very reminiscent of Studio Ghibli. It is very reminiscent of any Japanese type of storytelling I have ever ingested, whether that be through video game, movie, or narrative form. The Japanese have a very slow, patient, and beautiful way of telling stories that I really appreciate, so I would highly recommend that you pick up this one if you like young adult fantasy, because as well as just being a generally good book, it also puts a new spin on the young adult fantasy genre, as it is a Japanese translated work and takes part in that culture. My exceeding expectations challenge for Care of Magical Creatures was to read a book under 160 pages, and during Booktubeathon I read Rat Queens Volume 1. I gave this 5 stars. I really loved it. I do want to get hold of some more volumes, but graphic novels are expensive, So I will get around to carrying on this series at some point because I did really love it. I also achieved an exceeding expectations in arithmancy. The first challenge for this was to read a book over 300 pages. For this, I read Acceptance, which is the third book in the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. However, I'm going to move on and talk about that when I talk about the second book in the trilogy, because I did also read that for another subject. The second challenge was to read a book that ends on an even page, and for that I read The Giver by Lois Lowry. I read this during Booktubeathon. I gave it 4 stars. I did enjoy it and will continue with the quartet. It's a children's dystopian, utopian type of situation, and I found the concept really intriguing. The execution was good, but I'm definitely persisting with the rest of this series for the concept. And lastly, for herbology, I received an is it acceptable or a pass, and I completed the first challenge, which was to read a book with green on the cover, and for that I read Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. So now I'm going to talk about the second 2 books in the Southern Reach trilogy. I did review the first one in my Booktubeathon wrap-up. I read the entire series in August. So the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer is a sci-fi that follows an area called Area X. In Area X, something weird has been happening. You don't know what it is, but it's hinted at that it is either extraterrestrial or environmental, but nobody knows. To try and find out what is going on in Area X, because there's no reception, you can't take cell phones in, there's no radio waves, nothing like sort of comes out the way it should. So they send in expeditions, and the first one follows a woman who's been sent in the 12th expedition and sort of what goes on there. So Authority, the second one, follows the new director of the Southern Reach, which is the government body that looks after the program. It's the department that looks into Area X. So you follow the new director as he comes, takes over the position of somebody who was thought quite high of, even though she was a little bit insane, and the struggles that he faces, as well as the weird things that start to happen. And then in the third book, you follow a lot of perspectives, including the character from the first book that went into Area X, the director of the Southern Reach, the old director of the Southern Reach, the lighthouse keeper who was around when Area X sort of transformed, and you also follow 3 different timelines. So the earliest timeline is when things were happening and Area X became Area X. The second is just before the 12th expedition heads into Area X, which is the expedition that the woman from the first book was a part of. And the third timeline is sort of present day, so where the narrative of the books has led up to that point. I gave the second 2 books 4 stars and the first book 5 stars. I really loved this trilogy. If you've been around a while, you'll know that I don't like magical realism because nothing's explained. And once again, I got to the end of this trilogy and absolutely nothing had been explained. Well, not nothing. There was enough that I was satisfied, but so much was left vague that I could definitely have had more, and I definitely wanted more answers. However, the vagueness of the ending sort of ties into the cause for the creation of Area X, and it's one of those metaphors. Like, if you ever watched season 2 of American Horror Story, where that ended and sort of nothing really came of it, that really pissed me off. So it's that kind of concept of this is not explained because the reason that it happens is not explainable. That's the sort of conclusion. However, with all of the different viewpoints and narratives in the third book, you did get enough to sort of satisfy you. What I will say is that Jeff Vandermeer has a very particular writing style. The first book is like an expedition diary. The second book can be kind of all over the place. And the third book is definitely all over the place because there's a lot of different people in different places mentally. He is really into semiotics, so there's a lot of double meaning in his words and you really have to dissect the text. However, the atmosphere was on point. It was so creepy and I just loved how he literally gave me nothing, so I just had to keep reading and reading and reading because I wanted more. So overall, this is like a 4.5 series for me. Really loved it. Would recommend if you're into hard sci-fi. I'm more like a sci-fi newbie and I would probably rather have been a little bit well versed in hard sci-fi before I headed into this. Although don't take my word for it that it is hard sci-fi because, like I said, I'm a newbie, I don't really know. But it is definitely at a more advanced level of sci-fi than I maybe should have been reading. But that's everything for my August wrap-up. Please let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought. I know a lot of you will have been loving Evelyn Hugo and I think quite a few of you will really not have liked the Hazelwood. But feel free to let me know. We can chat about books down in the comments as usual. Please also don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you want to. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount if you'd like to check any of that out. But that's it from me today. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.